I'm investigative journalist Molly Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm Molly Barrows, a longtime reporter in Florida's Panhandle, and welcome to my investigative series, Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier stories that surface in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf of Mexico. My co-host is Pam Hill. Pam, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
As always, it is a pleasure to have the very knowledgeable Pam Hill with us. Her sister was killed by her son, Pam's nephew, on Christmas Eve of 2013, so she has personally experienced violent crime. And as a pharmacist and grief and loneliness researcher, she has a unique perspective on many of the cases that I talk about here on Gulf Coast Confidential. And in this episode, we're going to be relying on her pharmacy experience. This episode is called Cash in the Collard Greens Pot. Pam, if you want to show them the pot there, that's why we have this
Big
aluminum thing here on the table.
In my family, that's our spaghetti pot.
Yeah, I have one that's similar to that too, and they're super light. And then it's always the pot that you see on like little kids' heads and stuff when they're running around.
Right on.
Playing some kind of a costume. But this is nothing to joke about in this particular story. This is about one of the most shocking government scandals to rock the Gulf Coast. It happened in 2001, and some of these details are so saucy. Some folks around town joke that you can't spell Escambia County without scam. If you're wondering what Escambia County is, that is the furthest west county in the state of Florida, almost to Alabama. It's bordered on Alabama by two sides, and that is the county where Pensacola is. And it's also where the governor had to step in and remove 4 Escambia County commissioners from office. They were charged and taken to jail all over Sunshine Law violations. If you're not familiar with the Sunshine Law, it is what makes Florida one of the most free, if you will, when it comes to public records and transparency, although there are some efforts that we can get into later to sort of minimize and reduce our effort to see what government officials are doing. And that's why I think this particular case is so important, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it. Tragically, one of those commissioners who was removed by the governor actually lost his life. We're talking about Willie Jr. He was Escambia County's first and at the time only Black commissioner to serve on the Board of County Commissioners, and he disappeared the day before he was to be sentenced for his role in that scandal. And when his body turned up under a house in Pensacola a month later, you can imagine it caused quite a stir, especially when this unusual death was ruled a suicide. Many people still find that conclusion hard to swallow, and to this day, they are hungry for answers, especially since some of those same concerns of Escambia County leaders making behind-the-scenes deals still exists. In 2001, former Florida Senate President and Escambia County Commissioner W.D. Childers was found guilty of violating the Sunshine Law and of bribing fellow Commissioner Willie Jr. to help make $6.2 million in land deals, including the purchase of a former Pensacola soccer complex. Childers ended up pleading no contest to discussing public business in private with 2 other suspended commissioners. He served almost 3 years of a 3.5-year prison sentence before he was released in 2009. In 2002, a jury also found Escambia County Commissioner Terry Smith guilty of violating Florida's open government law by discussing public business in private with W.D. Childers on 2 different occasions, but Smith did not serve any jail time. Childers and Smith were both found guilty of making a call to the Escambia Supervisor of Elections to discuss redistricting. Only Smith was convicted over that second conversation, which actually happened over lunch at a Whataburger, they say. 2 other Escambia County commissioners, Mike Bass and Willie Jr., were also suspended over those Sunshine Law violations and similar charges involving that same corruption scandal that Childers was caught up in. Bass and Jr. both pleaded no contest to Sunshine Law violations, but it was in 2004, the day before he was to be sentenced, that Willie Jr. disappeared. And more serious charges of bribery, racketeering, extortion, and grand theft were other charges that he was to be sentenced on. His body was found under a friend's house in East Hill. In December of 2004, a neighbor reported an awful smell coming from under the home of an elderly man who lived there, Benjamin Dudley, who it turns out Willie Jr. had known for years. Police looked under the house, and that's where they found Junior's decomposed body. They had to use dental records to identify him. They believe his death was a suicide, that he crawled under the house with his favorite beer, Heineken, and drank it along with some antifreeze. The autopsy found that Willie Jr. died of ethylene glycol poisoning. In fact, one of the Heineken beer bottles found on the scene was submitted for analysis, and the test revealed that that was the active ingredient in most automobile antifreeze, and that is what he was ingesting. So it's an interesting case, Pam. You and I are both from here. We know how big a deal this was. To folks who may be peering in and listening from other parts of the country that maybe aren't familiar with Northwest Florida or Florida in general or Florida politics, although I do feel like Florida man stories have certainly probably given people a taste for some of the craziness that goes on around here. And I think we also have Florida's fantastic sunshine laws to thank for Florida man getting that reputation. So many details in these police reports are allowed to be, broadcast, if you will, because of our records laws. But describe for people a little bit, if you will, what politics is like in Northwest Florida. I think Wild West kind of comes to mind.
I think so. And, well, quite the characters here. Willie Jr. was quite the character. W.D. Childers was quite the character.
The Banty Rooster.
Yeah, he was the Banty Rooster, scrappy guy. But I knew Willie Jr. because he would come up to my dad's store. So let's just talk about Willie for a minute. He was, I would say, a striking black man, tall, and he always dressed to the nines. He was dapper. He loved Corvettes. He loved to take care of people. I think he was in the Army when he was younger and a paratrooper, and got honorably discharged and went right here to UWF. And while he was at UWF, he started the first Black Student Union. So you can see where we're going with this man. He wants to help his community. He's being the first in a lot of things.
Absolutely. And that was an uphill battle because, basically Pensacola, we've had race riots here. We had, as recently as the 1970s, students, were upset about basically a rebel symbol, if you will, that was the mascot for one of the high schools. And Willie Jr. was involved in helping to bring peace to that situation. But it is very much a segregated Pensacola that he grew up in. Like I said, he was the first Black commissioner in about 150 years to serve the county. And that comes at a price. I mean, he was able to do a lot for his constituents who were predominantly minority. They were predominantly, a lot of them came from poor neighborhoods. But he had to make a lot of deals with the white guys in charge in order to get some of that done.
Right. And nobody had been down this path before that he could talk to or say, hey, when we see someone and go, you're like me, how did you do that? But so he's staying here. He's a Pensacola guy. He said he looked around and he saw the richest black man in Pensacola was the funeral director. So he becomes a funeral director. So here we got a funeral director / politician / performer. You know how I call the people the P.T. Barnum, the people that keep the circus going. And he was proud of Pensacola. And he was a good commissioner. He would answer his phone 24/7. They said he's always on the phone. If you wanted a pothole fixed, Willie Jr. would get it fixed. He was good at maybe doing some of the legwork. He was not good at business. He was not good at paying money back. I know that.
But he was good at spending money.
Yes. Well, he would come borrow money from my dad sometimes. And my dad loved Corvettes. So he'd be up there talking to my dad. And I guess it was slight amusement to my dad. Here's somebody like so much. He's standing there. He's like a character in Starsky and Hutch type of thing. This kind of guy. But he came across as sophisticated to me. And so my dad and him would be talking about these things. And we would contribute to his campaign sometimes, like my dad did most everybody. So I saw him around. I saw him in his Corvettes, and I was like, okay, do your thing, So he did grow up in a segregated, it wasn't officially segregated, but it was segregated.
Absolutely. And that was definitely reflected in government. And W.D. Childers, former Senate president, had basically lost that position in Tallahassee due to term limits. So he came back and he ran for a county commission seat. And when he got onto the Escambia County Commission, he basically took over. This is a guy that already had a reputation for, like I said, that his nickname was the Banty Rooster because he was the cock of the walk. He would, sort of hustle and be an in-your-face kind of guy to get things done. And he did bring home the bacon for Northwest Florida and Pensacola in a lot of ways. But basically, it was his pushiness, his bulliness, his desire to get things done behind the scenes that brought down some of these other commissioners, in my opinion. And Willie Jr. got tied up in it. And what made Willie Jr. weak, especially in Escambia County politics, is because of that lifestyle that you're describing. gambling.
Yeah.
He enjoyed spending money. He wasn't great with it, but he had girlfriends. He was known to have plenty of girlfriends, even though he was married. He liked the fancy clothes, the fancy cars, the fancy girls. And he spent a lot of money on all of them. And I think it was knowing that he was in debt and struggling for money that is why it was easy for W.D. Childers to basically bribe him.
Right.
You know, when it came time, he went along with what it was that he was supposed to vote for because he needed the cash.
Right. And W.D., he was the hell no senator.
That's right.
He was the president of the Florida Senate. So this is a man that you don't say no to. He's had plenty of people to copy off of and follow. And actually, he was a trailblazer himself. People copy off him.
Absolutely.
Because I look around, the Sunshine Law, asked Ted Bundy about the Sunshine Law. Even the judge during Ted Bundy's trial told him, you straighten up. You're in the state of Florida. We have a Sunshine Law. That means we do our business in the sunshine. And that's what I think most of us think the Sunshine Law is. It's that simple. Quit all this backroom stuff, going to Whataburger to eat, not having this meeting and having that meeting and stuff. You get paid to get up there, and we're not dummies. What do you make? $80,000 a year, and you're living like you make $200,000. I mean, I don't know why people think we don't see that.
I know. And that's why it was so suspicious when he disappeared, because this was a scandal that was making headlines for basically a couple of years. It broke in 2001. He didn't pass until 2004. But, police, when they were doing the investigation, it was odd. There was just so much about it that was odd. The circumstances around his disappearance were odd. The fact that he disappeared right before he was to be sentenced on all these serious charges. The fact that he wasn't seen for days and people thought maybe he was running or trying to avoid responsibility, but then to be found under a house and then the authorities ruled it a suicide, a lot of people just don't buy it. To this day, they don't believe it. But it was very interesting. You know, I've read the medical examiner's reports. I've read the police reports about that, and they indicate that I went in thinking that maybe there is some truth to it. Maybe somebody did ask him nicely to drink antifreeze, you know, maybe he went along with it or felt like this was the better recourse. But after reading all these reports, I do feel like he might have actually committed suicide. I don't know. I could easily be swayed or convinced another way if I had more information. But from what I've seen of these reports, they said that, you know, basically this was an old house. There was a big crawl space. Benjamin Dudley was somebody that he had known who had worked for him before at the funeral home. He was an older man. And it was a house then a person that Willie was familiar with. We'd had Hurricane Ivan come through just a few months earlier. And in fact, Willie and his wife had gone to this very same house where his body was found in this great, quaint community of East Hill. And he had gone to check on Mr. Dudley to see how he was doing in the wake of the storm. And I wonder if he wasn't thinking then, you know, if I decided to take myself out, maybe going back to this familiar place, but going under a house for a guy that liked to have a haircut and liked to look nice. I mean, a lot of people just don't buy it. They just say it doesn't make any sense. But there was indications that he sat there. The medical examiner's reports say that there's evidence that he did crawl under there, and they could see, you know, basically tracks in the dirt where he crawled under there, where he found a place to sit, and he sat there and he drank. He drank the beer. There was also a Whataburger cup, and that also had evidence of the antifreeze in there. So they think he could put drinking it from both sources or pouring it from that cup into the beer bottles. At any rate, there was indications that he spent some time there, and that would indicate that he knew what he was doing. Almost 2 years earlier, in February of 2003, there had been a what police described as an unusual circumstance. They had been called to his house by his wife, and he had taken a bunch of different pills. And so they felt like perhaps that was another potential suicide attempt. That was not long after, of course, the whole scandal had broke in 2001. So as a pharmacist, tell us a little bit about what antifreeze does. That seems like a weird way to take yourself out, but really it's not that painful from what I understand.
You kind of go numb and can pass out. Antifreeze is sweet. It's colorless and odorless. That's why people that are poisoning other people with it put it in Gatorade or something like this. My favorite type drink, Kool-Aid, in there because that's sweet anyway. But they do that and it's supposedly smooth to drink. I've never drank it myself, you know. But I was thinking about, like with Willie, he was facing 125 years before he took his plea deal. And his plea deal pleaded down to 18 months. He walked around Pensacola disappointing people left and right. He wasn't worried about that. He cheating on his wife left and right. poor Miss Abby, she's like, Mr. Junior does what Mr. Junior does. I mean, what could she do? He's responsible for himself. But he was a very proud man. And, the NAACP had offered to do a second autopsy that they would pay for. And Miss Abby said she declined. And, it's her right to decline. But maybe it was just so much. We don't know what goes on. But you look at people's personality and their essence. His essence was not to crawl up under there and die, like one person said, like a dog.
Right.
And like I said, if you can walk around here all these other years and do this, that, and the other, but he may have just rattled the wrong cage.
Well, he was also in so much debt. I mean, it wasn't just about facing prison time or jail time. I think it was also not having the money, not being the man around town, because he was the man. I mean, there was, I remember talking to people who did car repossessions, and they were like, after Willie passed, we were getting cars left and right from all the cars that he bought for his girlfriends.
Yeah.
So there were also, indications that people would prepay for funerals. He would take that money, spend it on other things, and then have to, rob the left hand to pay the right hand sometimes.
Yeah, he's
right.
like Robin Hood. Well, he did have some questionable business things. Like I said, he was not good at business. He was good at the promotion. He was good at the sideshow. He was good at the smoke show. WD was good at the business. WD, back in the day, he was from the West Side. He saw ahead. He was a trendsetter. He's the one that helped promote like hula hoops and slinkies and color TV and stuff, and he sold it right over there on the West Side with
Along with tires.
Right, with other reputable business people. W.D. Childers was a good businessman. He was not necessarily somebody's favorite, but Willie Jr. had that charm and charisma.
He was a good politician.
Right, and people will forgive you for anything, mostly, if you say, I'm sorry.
Yes.
And I think he knew that because he had enjoyed that benefit many, many times. His wife forgave him. The people forgave him. He even, when he was head of community action program known as the Cheese Man around town, he would slip his business card in there to the elderly, and it said, if I am found dead, take me to Junior Funeral Home, which Junior Funeral Home was sort of like a tourist attraction. It was even a question on Hollywood Squares. Is there really a drive-through funeral home in Pensacola, Florida? Why, yes, there is Hollywood Squares. It is Willie Jr.'s. And he knew how to capitalize on that.
Yeah.
So he knew all that. He kept the sideshow. So I'm like, only thing I can think of is that he got weary in the process.
If it was suicide,
Right.
you're saying, right? If we're because I'm like you. I think after I did all this research, I was like, well, I'm going to go ahead and go along with this, and I think that maybe he did kill himself. But at the same time, I don't really know. I didn't know him that well personally. I had met him several times and interviewed him early on. I had just started working as a reporter locally a few years before that whole scandal broke, and I remember when it broke, and I remember it was just one headline after the other every day. It seemed like there was something new to report on this scandal. And another person who was, it was, to your point, a whole cast of characters. And another one of those characters that was involved in this case is Pensacola's favorite celebrity attorney, Frederick G. Levin.
Yeah.
And he, of course, he made a huge name for himself, being the author of rewriting the Florida Medicaid law that allowed the state of Florida to sue successfully Big Tobacco and win. And so it just resulted in a tremendous windfall for the state of Florida. It's what enabled Mr. Levin to make this huge $10 million donation to the University of Florida and got the law school named after him. And he was also friends with WD because guess who helped him get that law changed in Tallahassee? WD Childers. He was Senate president at the time, so he had it on the agenda. It was one of the last things that they slid onto the agenda. Basically, a midnight change. Fred rewrote the law. WD got it passed, opened the door for them to change it, and states across the nation replicated that law. And it also allowed them to go after Big Tobacco and basically sue to get reimbursed for medical expenses that they were paying for illnesses related to tobacco, to cancer and to tobacco smoking. But, Fred Levin got involved when this case broke, and WD and a couple others, they were essentially, the state was looking into it. Our state attorney at the time, Curtis Golden, who recently passed, longtime state attorney. And again, if you're not familiar with Northwest Florida, we're talking Wild West politics. These guys are scrappers.
Yep.
I don't think it surprises anyone, certainly not any of our listeners in Louisiana. They're familiar with what goes on behind the scenes. I think here along the South and the Gulf Coast, we don't exactly always expect our politicians to be honest and right, but we want them to be honest and right for the most part, to at least put our constituents ahead. I hate to be such a cynic, but, I think that there's a certain amount of bending the rules that I think a lot of voters will put up with, but they don't necessarily want to just keep somebody in office who is blatantly using the position for their own benefit and not even bothering to try to help their constituents. So I think maybe WD was carrying the same sort of Banny Rooster, cock of the walk, I'm in charge attitude that he carried in Tallahassee for so long. He brought it with him to the commission. And he did the same thing. He was trying to force this purchase of he pressured Willie Jr. to vote with him on a couple of deals that put money in the pockets of people that Childers knew, and he bribed Willie Jr. to do it. And so the state, Curtis Golden was looking into it, and the commissioners essentially start to tell what happened. And some people would say Willie Jr. turned on others. But, I mean, I think he just knew that he was in trouble. They were all caught to a certain extent. Not everybody served jail time, but Escambia County is, by the way, the only place in the state of Florida where 2 public officials have served jail time for violating the Sunshine Law. W.D. Childers is one of those. Another was around that same time, but she was a school board member, Vanette Webb. She had withheld a public record from a Pensacola mother. But these other commissioners that were also taken to task for violating the Sunshine Law, they did not serve jail time. But Willie Jr. was going to be facing all sorts of charges, including that. And Fred Levin gets involved. He's representing WD. He is not one to shy away from the camera or the press. Anybody that knows Fred, of course, we've seen him on magazine covers and all sorts of news shows, from coast to coast. He is well loved and quite the character. But he also had sort of a notorious reputation. People always kind of associated him with being a gangster, even though there's like a cover of Time magazine where Fred Levin's saying, I'm not a gangster.
I love him. I love Fred Levin.
I know.
I love him so much.
But he called Willie Jr. a rat.
Oh, yeah. He's
a rat fink.
Well, you know how I feel about people that are leveling a charge. My dad told me, if you're going to level a charge at someone, point right at him and say, I'm talking to you.
Right.
And so that's what he did. And like I said, I love Fred Levin. He has done some wonderful things here for Pensacola and the nation. I think about that tobacco thing much like the way the opioid thing's going today. It's that big. But also he had where he was another case where I think it was a train right there on Scenic Highway.
Yeah, that was his first big win.
Right, that got a lot of the gases and poisons out. And you can't help but love somebody like this. He was for the little girl, instead of the little guy. It's the first time that anybody really vigorously argued that a woman's life.
A homemaker.
Right.
Yeah, because a train tipped over, there was poisonous gases, it killed a couple and disabled their children as well. And so, yeah, that was the first time he was successfully able to win a settlement for the value of the life of a homemaker.
Right. And I dealt with Fred Levin. I was the pharmacist for Square Wing Productions and, Roy Jones Jr. and
Fred Levin was a supporter of Roy Jones Jr.
And Ricky Bynum and that whole bunch, just by the way, Roy Jones Jr. never had to have any medicine for his nose because he never got hit in the nose.
He was too fast.
He's too pretty. All right. But anyway, Fred Levin, this is such a cast of characters.
Right. And so I think that to the point we bring him up because that also added to the intrigue of, well, what happened to Willie Jr.? If he died under the house, did Fred Levin have something to do with it? Which I personally do not think that's the case at all. But people have reason for thinking that because there were other crazy cases, which I am going to cover this on Gulf Coast Confidential, but we had a plane that exploded over a road in Pensacola back in the late 80s that a Gulf Power executive was on that plane. It was at the time Gulf Power was being investigated by the IRS for making illegal campaign contributions to candidates through vendors like public relations companies that worked locally. So the Gulf Power is in the midst of this investigation. This particular executive feels like the noose is starting to tighten around his neck. And I have looked into it a little bit, but essentially he's going to fly to Atlanta to talk to investigators about what is going on at Gulf Power. And then the plane blows up not long after takeoff. Wow. He dies along with 2 pilots. And they also tried to rule that that was a suicide attempt of some sort, that he had started a fire deliberately to cause this explosion. And the last place that this particular executive was before he got on the plane was Fred Levin's office. He had gone to talk to him about the situation involving Gulf Power, and I've talked to Fred Levin about it. Fred sadly has passed, but I remember asking him, like, well, what did he talk to you about in that conversation? He said, well, he just was telling me that he felt like they were trying to pin it all on him, and he was going to come clean, and he was going to talk about everything that was actually going on with Gulf Power. But there are people who think that Fred had something to do with that bomb on the plane, and I certainly do not think that, and I don't think there's any evidence to support that. But my point being that Fred was such a larger-than-life character. He was so successful. He was so approachable. He was so likable, so not afraid of letting people know what he thought, that I think it was easy for people to maybe draw these conclusions and assume that maybe he had some nefarious role, which I do not think that he did. But it did add to that allure of like, well, why was maybe something did happen. Maybe Willie was murdered. He was running with this dangerous, wealthy crowd.
Like an urban legend.
Right.
And I mean, like, I think a lot of that is that they were friends. WD and Fred
All
were
of them,
friends. Of
yeah.
course, you're going to get your friend to represent you, and he's one of the best attorneys in the
Well,
world.
and let's be honest, they looked at Willie Jr. as the one black guy on the commission who was to be told what to do, not necessarily to be one of an equal, if you will.
Well, we got the good old boy system here. You know, I think a lot of places have it, but we sure have it here. And I think that with Willie Jr., he, like I say, he's looking at 125 years, but they had bargained that down to 18 months. He can do that standing on his head. You know, he was that kind of person. He wasn't, he was a good person. He just was not a good businessman. And here we talk about this all the time. What happens when people get into a position that, you know, it's one they've never had before, there's an intoxication with it. And then you're getting admiration from people, and people are letting this go and that go, which, you know, that's the cost of doing business sometimes. But Willie Jr., I feel like we say sometimes, his drug of choice was more.
That's exactly right. And he needed more money, which is where this crazy detail of the collard green pot comes in.
Soccer complex stuff.
Exactly. When WD was bribing him, he bribed him with cash. So there would be no basically bank transaction. And he brought it to him, all this cash, in a collard green pot.
What for?
I guess he just thought that was cute. I don't know.
I guess
I thought that was kind of strange.
$90,000 from WD and $10,000 from another family.
I feel like that's almost a math question.
Yeah.
How much, if you have a collard green pot that's 4 quarts and you have a lot of money for a bribe, how many stacks of tens can you get into there?
And then there was a note in there that said 100/100. $100,000 for me. $100,000 for you. And basically the wink to, and there's more to come.
That's exactly right. So Willie did vote like he was asked to do on those deals, and millions of dollars were exchanged of taxpayers' money, and some of it went into the pocket of people that WD knew, and some of it went into Willie's pocket, and some of it went into WD's pocket. And I think, you know, the reason that it's important, I think, to bring these up, I just did a story. You know, I cover politics, local government, for Gannett, for the Pensacola News Journal. And recently I did a story where I had to recap all of these crimes because of how it connected to the violations of the Florida Sunshine Law. Not that we've had any local leaders commit violations of the Sunshine Law that I'm aware of, but they have canceled what's called Committee of the Whole meetings. And before you eyes roll, if you're listening or watching, you know, I don't think anybody particularly likes meetings. If you're anything like me, you know, I don't think we all scramble to go attend a meeting. So I can certainly understand why these commissioners don't. They already have meetings after meetings after meetings. But, you know, you sign up for it. That's part of your job. You're making almost $100,000 a year. Suck it up, go to a meeting.
Yeah.
But these Committee of the Whole meetings they're basically workshops. They can't all vote together to take any action on anything, but they can discuss things where the public can hear it. And then at their regular meetings, or what's called agenda review meetings, they can discuss. And at the regular meetings, they can vote and make a decision. So other counties close by, our neighboring counties, hold regular Committee of the Whole meetings. Our county, Escambia County policy says they're supposed to have these Committee of the Whole meetings once a month in order to basically vet and discuss these things, because Florida Sunshine Law says 2 or more members of the same board can't discuss something in private, especially if it's going to be something that they're going to have to take action on as a board. So it begs the question, well, if you're not discussing these issues at Committee of the Whole, if you're only waiting till the regular meetings to discuss them. And a lot of times they have questions. They may not fully understand the implications. A lot of these government decisions are complicated, and they involve, lots of decisions about grants or financial decisions. And there's just a lot to take in. So these committee of the wholes are supposed to be that opportunity for the public to see these discussions, see what questions they're asking, how they're coming to the decisions that they're making. And what's happening is they've canceled all of these committee of the whole meetings for the past year, and they've eliminated them from the 2024 meeting agendas. So no committee of the whole meetings. And I did an interview with a lady named Barbara Peterson, who is with a group that essentially holds government officials accountable and make sure that they are abiding by Florida law and holding government in the sunshine. They were, in fact, influential in securing public records from the state of Florida that had to do with when Governor Ron DeSantis flew those immigrants to Martha's Vineyard.
Okay.
They wanted to understand more about where that money came from, how it was spent. So this is the kind of information that we can gather that's important, I think, for voters and constituents to know. But, when I'm talking to Barbara, her first thing is they have, because the county commissioner said we're eliminating these additional public meetings because we don't think they're necessary. It's just more work for staff, taking time away when they could be doing the work of the people. And Barbara Peterson was like, I call BS. I say they should be doing that work anyway. They've got to do that research anyway. She goes, and if they're not discussing it at the committee of the whole, then it begs the question, where are they discussing it?
Yes.
If they're just waiting until the meeting where they actually have to vote and there's hardly any discussion, or maybe just a few minutes or a little bit of discussion, if you will, compared to what is typically in the past has taken hours to discuss. And now they're basically saying, well, we're efficient and we don't need these meetings. So it was just an interesting article to let people know, here's the situation. They haven't had these meetings in a year. They don't intend to have them in the next year. Nobody's saying they did anything wrong, but it is a cause for concern because it does limit the public's access to their information gathering and their process into how they make the decisions that they do. And in light of Escambia County's history, which we're talking about here, she brought up, I ended the article with a quote from her saying, Escambia County is special. Escambia County is the only place in Florida where 2 of your elected officials have gone to jail for violating sunshine law, and so secrecy fosters distrust. And whether or not they're doing anything wrong, it is the appearance of, are you doing anything wrong? And it's easy for people to wonder in a place like Escambia County.
Right. Well, I would want to be efficient. I would want to be transparent. We overuse that word a lot, but I would if I were a politician. There's 2 things I hardly will talk to people about, and that is keto carbs and politics.
Right.
I just don't like talking about either one of those. But on politics, it's the image of it, what it looks like.
It's the perception.
Too, right. And why wouldn't you want to be efficient and vigorous and stuff? I feel like that is what's going on in not just politics, but business and life these days. Everybody gives it the good old, that's about all we're going to do. I mean, why are people rushing to do the least they can instead of the best they can? I'm going to vote for you when you tell me you've shown up and you've out there fixing potholes. That's what Willie Jr. was good at, because people go, well, he might pay you back, he might not. Okay, that's true. But he fixed that pothole within 24 hours. He answered me, type of thing. And sometimes I don't know what these bunches think they're going to do right now. So you're not going to have any meetings in all of 2024. Well, let's just go ahead and say we're not going to have them in 25, 26, 27 if they're a pain in the ass.
Basically, I bring this up because it ties into Escambia County's past in the public.
Right.
And ideally, hopefully, we have good leaders that are putting the taxpayers' best interests at heart, and it's probably most likely that is the case. But when you're not having the kind of meetings that are typically in the past have allowed the public to see more of the inner workings and how these decisions are made, it is a thing that makes you have pause in Escambia County, for sure.
It just doesn't seem honorable to me to want to do less for people when you're in a public servant. A servant serves. You don't just hide and be secret and stuff like that. There are so many frustrations with the way the world is right now. I think politicians should be accessible. I understand you can't see everybody. You have a staff.
And you can't fix everything
Right,
either,
right.
but you can listen.
Right. And we can add 1 and 1 makes 2. If you make 80 to 100,000 and you're living like you make $250,000, I think people just better be ready for what happens with that.
Right. And to my point earlier, I think people expect a little bit of quid pro quo in politics.
I think they do a little
without
bit.
a doubt. You know, you've got to make one deal in order to get something for your district. You might have to agree to something else in somebody else's district. But the problem comes in when there's no accountability because, you know, there's that saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And call me a cynic, but I do believe that. I've seen it over and over and over in my many years of reporting. I've met people who were running for office and they had the best of intentions and good hearts and enthusiasm and you know, we're going to do all the right things. And in no time at all, I just got to where I could just tell, like, oh, well, when you get into office, we'll see how long that lasts. And I've seen it over and over again. And sometimes they've come out unscathed and sometimes they've gotten caught and weren't voted back in.
Yeah.
But power does go to their heads. And if there isn't a lot of, and I can certainly understand being burdened by these meetings. You know, it is something to consider if you've got so many meetings and it's taking so much time that it's become inefficient. You're not able to get work done because you're having to abide by all these, you know, tedious legal processes. I certainly can understand that. But the bottom line is be transparent. Let voters know. Why did I have to come and ask you what happened with these meetings? Why didn't you just say, hey, public, we're considering canceling these. What do you think about it? So I think, you know, whether there's anything wrong or not, it's about communication and giving the appearance that you do care about what the public wants. And it isn't just about pushing your own personal agenda behind the scenes and then convincing the voter that it's for their best interest when it was really for your personal interest.
Well, people aren't stupid. I kind of take offense to when people try to do that, as I call it, flim flam ram around. I don't buy it. I'm not exceptionally brilliant, but I got, you know, intelligence like of an average person at least. But I mean, you can't just say, I don't like doing that, so I'm not going to do it. If somebody else before, like think about the military, you know, they have to do stuff they don't want to do, but you do it in pharmacy. I don't like doing continuing education and having to pay for it and do it necessarily. I do like it because I learn, but I mean, I could say I don't.
Right. It could also be tedious on top of a full-time job, on top of all the other responsibilities that you have.
So I mean, like, we see you. The days of people hiding and the days of all this kind of flim flam ram around that happened here. And by the way, my heart just says I love Willie Jr. He's a good man. He just messed up. And I love Fred Levin. He's a good man, just messed up. And I like WD. You know, so none of this is personal.
I think that's such a great point to make. I can't tell you the number of times that I have done a story and been personally attacked. And I think that's often the case. You know, that's where the adage, don't kill the messenger comes from.
Right.
But I also think, too, perhaps when people aren't comfortable with explaining themselves, it's easier to attack you and make it sound like you're coming after them for a personal reason because they can't be honest about what their real motivations were.
Well,
you know, it's just a job. It's just what I do. I report on what happened. I don't care what you do, but it's my job to report on what you do.
And
so
I thank you for that. Because somebody has to be honorable and somebody has to be hard-hitting. Someone has to know the facts. I'm sure it's not fun for you to have to learn. You don't want to have to sit around and learn all the politics things. You're a reporter. You're a lively little lady. I mean, all that's boring to me.
I know. Well, it is. Sometimes it is pretty boring. But again, to the importance of those meetings, when you're sitting there, you see how long these discussions take. You see the body language, the personal relationships, the interactions between individual commissioners, the interactions between the commissioners and the public. There's just a lot that you can learn from attending these meetings as opposed to just reading about them later or even watching them online, which I think all of that's great. People do need to be informed. It is great that we have that option to watch online, and a lot of Escambia County meetings are put online. So I do think that there is a genuine, authentic effort to keep the public informed. But to your point, you know, everybody's busy. They have their own lives, and they rely on reporters to basically gather a lot of this information and present it. And in recent years, I think it's just become too easy for politicians to try to demonize and paint reporters as the problem. Because they want to hide what they're doing. So it's got to be, well, the source of this information is personally attacking me. The source of the information is the problem, not the person that they're talking about. And that's not to say that all reporters are perfect and never wrong. And that's not to say that all politicians are corrupt and doing a bad thing. There's going to be some of both. But for the most part, it's not personal. We're all just doing our job. But in my experience, those that turn around and point the finger the fastest that they've been you know, maligned and mistreated by that mean old reporter people.
That lady.
That is just because they don't want to be accountable for what they've done.
Right. Well, and let's just face it. Let's grow up. Let's do our jobs. People need to put their back into their jobs. I don't know what's happened where people don't want to work. People don't want to have to do this, do that. Do your job. It's what you're supposed to do. Honor people and do it gladly. And if you don't want to do it, get out.
That's how I feel about it. Don't run.
Yeah. Get out. And that's my...
They don't want to be questioned, I think, in some
you're
cases.
not a king. We don't, not a country of a monarchy with princes that run around and stuff. Here's my thing. Keep doing all that fraganacle BS and get what you get and don't throw a fit.
And I think, to your point, that's exactly what we saw with WD. I think he had spent years at the height of his game, and then he goes back into local politics, trying to be the same cock of the walk that he was in Tallahassee, and he was bullying everyone in the county who didn't go along with him. If they didn't like him, he was kicking people out of their positions. He was firing them or making their lives so miserable that they quit. And I think that, that power can go to their heads, and I think, to your point, that's why this story is still important and relevant to talk about today, because these men are not unique in their weaknesses. These leaders are not unique. I mean, it is tough to lead. It is tough to have all these pressures and to have to make these constant compromises and to have all these relationships. I would not envy them. I've not run for office. I get it, But at the same time, if you're not in it for the right reasons, if the power has gone to your head, then step aside. Let somebody else who actually can find some balance and put the voter and the constituent's best interest first.
Yeah, or if you're tired, go on. That's what I don't understand. Just quit hanging around doing all that.
Because eventually you will get caught, just like WD did.
Count on it.
And brought other people down with him.
Count on it. Well, this story hurts my heart a little bit because I say, rest in peace, Willie Jr.
Yes, rest in peace, Willie Jr. And also, WD is an older man now, 89. I don't know how many more years he has left on this planet, but he did a lot of great things for Escambia County. And I don't want to end this without saying that that's all he should be remembered for, tragically. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's the significant things, whether they're good, bad, or otherwise, that we get remembered for. But he did so much great. He brought home so much bacon for Northwest Florida. He was behind many important projects, including the creation of Interstate 110. I mean, he just did a lot for, and through Pensacola. And so all of them contributed in their own ways, including Willie Jr. He'll always be remembered as a man of his people and the man of the people of Escambia County, and he helped his constituents. So I enjoy recounting this story simply because there is such a cast of characters that we remember and we knew, but at the same time, it is heartbreaking because we still don't fully have answers. And I think there's still some healing that needs to be done in this community when it comes to trust for our leadership.
Yep. Well, we can just pray and we can hope that people see the light. And here's something that's so simple. Just do the next right thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect way to end this segment. Anything else you'd like to add, Pam?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, signing off from Gulf Coast Confidential, we are also trying to do the next right thing and appreciate you for joining us on this episode of Gulf Coast Confidential, Cash in the Collard Greens Pot. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Molly Barrows, with co-host and researcher Pam Hill. And a big thanks, as always, to director, editor, and production engineer James Roy. And remember, you can listen to more Gulf Coast Confidential conversations wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And you can also watch on the Gulf Coast Confidential YouTube channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you next time.